The United Nations will investigate reports that someone used chemical weapons in northern Syria. The Assad regime says rebels were responsible for an attack near Aleppo and asked Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to look into it. But others say it was the regime that was responsible, not just for one, but two attacks. Lindsay Duncombe is following the story from Washington and joins us now with more. So, Lindsay, let's talk about the original request from Syria. What does the Assad regime claim happened here?
Well, the request came to the UN from the Syrian ambassador, and what the regime believes happens is that opposition forces fired a rocket at civilians and that rocket had chemical agents in it, and at least 16 people in the initial reports were killed. Now, this was originally reported on the state-owned television. These pictures that we're seeing came in, and there is some question as to whether or not the victims of this alleged attack have injuries that would be consistent with a chemical weapons attack. So there's uncertainty about what actually happened, but there's no question that the United Nations has long been concerned about chemical weapons attacks as part of what's happening in Syria. Here is what Ban Ki-moon said today about what the UN is going to do in terms of the investigation.
I have repeatedly stated that use of chemical weapons by any side under any circumstances would constitute an outrageous crime. Anyone responsible must be held accountable.
But what isn't clear about what the UN is going to do in Syria is the scope of this investigation. The opposition forces say that it wasn't them that did this attack. They say it was the regime. In fact, that they say there have been two chemical weapons attacks at the hands of the regime. And there are countries lining up to ask the United Nations not just to answer this one specific request and look into the specific incident, but to broaden the scope of the investigation and look into all of the allegations. And based on the statement we heard from the Secretary General today, it's unclear just how wide this probe will be.
Any idea then, Lindsay, what the upshot of this request from those who say the rebels couldn't possibly be responsible and they want to investigate the claim by rebels that there's no way they could have done this? Any idea of whether or not the UN is prepared to take that into consideration so that the investigation will be broader and address everyone's allegations?
Well, it's interesting. The Secretary General did say that they were aware of the request to look more broadly into it, but he didn't go so far as to say what the specifics are. He did address how difficult this is because we're dealing with Syria, and there are obstacles to getting information in Syria. They're going to need to have access, and they're going to need to have cooperation with the regime. So I think a lot of that will have to be worked out once those investigators get on the ground. And this is an incredibly high-stakes situation because the use of chemical warfare could change the direction of the conflict in Syria, which has been going on for 2 years now. The President of the United States has said that use of chemical weapons would be a game changer. And Barack Obama says that he believes that it is obviously the Assad regime that would have access to those chemical weapons. And he said if Assad did use chemical weapons, there would be consequences. Barack Obama not saying what those consequences would be, waiting to find out exactly what happened or what is happening in Syria before they make any decisions on that front. So this United Nations investigation, cooperating with other internal or international organizations, will be very key to what happens next inside Syria.